But just imagine what a different Britain we could be living in if ordinary working class people could have something like lower middle class jobs and the spending to go with it, and their kids could have the education that would follow from that and the rest of it. We could have had a very different last 50 years.
The next person to speak was ex-BNP, ex-Democratic Nationalist, and now with the British Democrats, okay? Please welcome to the stage, Jim Lewthwaite.
What set me off on thinking about myth-busting was, like the rest of you, I've been subjected to barrages of propaganda about the so-called Windrush scandal, in the course of which I was watching on TV various dusky-hued gentlemen insisting that they were just as British as I was. One said, "I am an Englishman, I have no links with the Caribbean whatsoever, and I hate being deported to it." And the second, of course, was the suggestion that there might be a Stephen Lawrence Day, presumably modelled on the Martin Luther King Day. And one immediately thought, hang on a minute, what about the white victims? Frank Black Sport, to my knowledge, lists 400 of them. But if we're going to have a day of remembrance, it should be a day of remembrance for all victims of racial violence, of whom the majority will be white. To actually single out a single black individual and ignore everything else is clearly part of a campaign of white guilt building, which is designed to keep us in a state of cowedness. Sorry, my English deserts me. A cowed state for the next century, feeling guilty that somebody murdered a black teenager, may or may not have murdered a black teenager, because the Met originally worked on the hypothesis that it was something to do with a drugs deal that went wrong. A great deal of the sainthood of Stephen Lawrence has been, of course, artificially built up to build him up as some sort of hero. He may, at the very worst, have been the victim of a single event. But other people have been the victim of campaigns going on for some time. When I was in Keighley, in the BNP campaigning of the early 2000s, I was approached, this is hard to believe, but it's true, by Pakistanis who were complaining that the murderers of a white teenager in Oldham, his name deserts me, but I remember it at the time, these Pakistanis came up and said the gangsters that had committed this crime were well known in the neighbourhood, were terrifying the Pakistanis in Keighley, and could the police not do something about it? Since they had approached all the legitimate mainstream parties and nothing had been done, they thought the BNP might be in with a chance. We approached the police and they said it was impossible to prosecute, despite the fact that these gangsters were walking around the streets of Keighley boasting that they had killed a white teenager in Oldham and got away with it. And they still have, because they've never been prosecuted. So perhaps we should bear that in mind when we contemplate Stephen Lawrence Day. So the two myths which had occurred to me need to be busted. The point is they can't be busted by an individual party. They can't be busted by the British Democrats or any other single group saying we protest about this. The only thing which will have any impact, if anything can have any impact on the establishment, will be a broad front nationalist grouping bringing together as many people as possible, and if possible bringing in the more decent elements from mainstream parties like UKIP and so on, because these are issues which are too big for any one party to address. And it would be too easy for the establishment to crush any protest if we were to write to the Home Secretary and say, we want a memorial day for all victims of racial violence. You can imagine what the press would do with it if it were just a single party, a single individual, something like Britain First or the National Front, whatever. It would be dismissed so easily and smeared. So it has to be a broad grouping and, as far as possible, incorporate people who are beyond smearing. Anyway, the two myths which I think we need to address are myths which are being implanted in our minds, and especially in the minds of school children, and we have to combat them before they become established as the received truth, as real history. The first one is, what was World War II fought about? And the second is the mass immigration of the 50s onwards from the Caribbean and the Indian subcontinent. Was it, as I was surprised, like probably many of you, to learn, was it because they were invited here to build up the country? I don't remember hearing anything about that in the 60s and 70s when immigration was going on. Surely, if you have a rhetorical trope of such power, that they were invited here and are doing us a huge favour and we should be eternally grateful, that would have been deployed when it was most useful, when the immigration was going on. And yet I have never heard that argument put forward until very recently. And in this context, where a government is trying to excuse what it did, as many speakers have said, without any permission from the British people, 50 years after the event, when hopefully many of the witnesses will be dead, and therefore unable to contradict this. I merely offer this as a hypothesis, but I think it takes a broad front nationalist response to these two myths before they become established as truth. Now, why did we fight World War II? Well, when I was a kid, and I'm not just talking about War Picture Library or Commando sort of paperbacks, I'm talking about standard history books. There was a war between Britain and France and Germany, to begin with, over the issue of the Danzig corridor, but there was a bigger principle behind that. It was one going back at least 2 centuries, probably 3. It was the balance of power in Europe, which was why it formed a continuity with World War I, which was the eternal German question of Germany trying to establish hegemony in Europe and an alliance of nations forming against it. In other words, it was all about restoring the equilibrium of power between the various nation states of Europe into what might be called a fair manner. But that's not what's being taught today, and there is a reason behind that. It is now being presented as our equivalent of the Soviet Great Patriotic War. A war unlike any other, just as the Holocaust, we are told, was an event unlike any other, though Armenians and other people who've been the victims of genocide might, of course, point out it wasn't the first any such event, and that I can think of Chinese annals going back to 2000, where the Chinese emperor said, "Are the UAG still a problem on the northwest frontier?" "Yes, Your Majesty." "Right, well, exterminate them, down to the last man and woman." So it's as old as human history. But I digress. The story we are being presented with is that World War II was an exception. It was a war against racism and fascism. It was a war against isms. Now, when George Bush declared a war on terror, he was told you can't declare a war on an abstract noun. It's unwinnable because it's an abstract principle. So, World War II, the war against racism and fascism. Curiously, there's no mention of a war against racism and fascism in Stanley Baldwin's proclamation of war. He says that we have given certain undertakings to the Poles, rightly or wrongly, and these undertakings have been destroyed by the British, by the German invasion of Poland. They have been told to withdraw. They have not withdrawn. Therefore, Britain will go to war. Nothing about regime change in Germany. Nothing about fighting abstract nouns. Nothing about racism or fascism. And in the name of the British Empire. Now, my mother lived through the Second World War. She was a school teacher in Scotland Road, Liverpool, and evacuated to North Wales. My father volunteered in 1938 to join the Border Regiment. We're a Cumbrian family. He fought in France. It missed Dunkirk, like many British troops. He was too far south to go out through Dunkirk. So he came out much later through Cherbourg on the ship after the Lancastria, the greatest maritime disaster in British history. More than 4,000 people killed when it was dive-bombed in Brest Harbour. So he was very lucky to get out. He was then posted to the Western Desert and fought with 5th Indian. He'd been transferred to the Jat Regiment by then, and he fought at Rysett Ridge in 1st Alamein, and then was passed on to Burma and fought on after World War II, because, little known fact, after the British Indian troops thought they were going home on VJ Day, they were told, no, you're not, you're going to Indonesia to help recapture Java for the Dutch. At which point, slight digression, the Japanese Army of Occupation of Indonesia became our allies, and the Indonesian guerrillas, who'd previously been our allies, became our enemies. Something which politicians could easily understand, but simple-minded soldiers obviously found a little bit difficult to understand why their former enemies were now being fed British Army rice, and they were told to cooperate with them in crushing the people who'd previously been fighting with us. But this brings us on to the wider question of the whole of World War II. When I spoke to my mother and father about the war, they said they were fighting for God, king, country, and empire. Now, you won't find that in a modern history book. We were fighting to defend the British Empire. Not so much obvious in the Western War, because Hitler was a firm supporter. Read Mein Kampf, and he emphasized that the British Empire was one of the foundations of the structure of the world. The last thing he wanted to do was destroy the British Empire. With Japan in the east, of course, it's the absolute opposite. They intended to invade the Dutch East Indies and Malaya and Burma and seize the oil, the tin, the rubber, the assets which they lacked entirely in Japan, and take them off us. And when we fought the Japanese, it's absolutely crystal clear that we're fighting in defense of the British Empire. So this is not what you're going to be taught in the history books of the future. And I have no doubt whatsoever that the establishment are hoping that when the last person dies who can remember what they actually fought for, then they will have nobody to deny that it was a war against racism and fascism, and can therefore be used to beat everybody over the head with who is a self-proclaimed racial nationalist. They will repeat to you endlessly, we fought wars against people like you, so how dare you suggest an idea which has not only outlived its time, but is utterly obnoxious. It will be forgotten that when Britain was supposedly stood alone, it wasn't alone, because it had a quarter of the world's population behind it. We had the Australians, the Canadians, the New Zealanders, the South Africans, the Rhodesians. 2.5 million people volunteered on the Indian subcontinent to the biggest volunteer army in the history of the world. Well, they wouldn't have done that if they'd been badly treated. The British rule in India could have been overthrown any time if the Indians had wanted to. But remember that India, with a capital I, is a creation of Europeans, because before we arrived, there were just a lot of Maharajas fighting each other. Indian nationalists could not be Indian nationalists without the idea of nationalism, alien to the Indian subcontinent, being implanted in their minds, because it is a Western concept, not an Indian concept. So a lot of the textbooks are simply repeating lies, but more importantly, they are ideologically driven to make us think in a way which is different from the way we do think and the way in which we ought to think. On a sidetrack, but an important one, I'd like to ask the audience a question. Whose fuel filled the tanks of the Messerschmitts over Kent in 1940, or Guderian's tanks driving for the coast before Dunkirk? There had been an economic blockade of Germany since the declaration of war, so no oil was getting in from outside Europe. Germany has very few oil wells, Austria few. You're probably going to say, oh, it's the Romanian oil from Ploiești, but the big deal with Romania only occurred after the fall of France. Well, it was from Joe Stalin. Joe Stalin was Adolf's best buddy at the time. The fuel in the tanks and the airplanes came from Maikop, Grozny, Baku, as part of the big deal agreed in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. In return for German finished goods, including a semi-completed cruiser and various other things, the Russians supplied Germany with things it was short of: grain, oil. It also passed on rubber and tin from Malaya and Burma, bought through third parties like the Japanese and so on, and transshipped the length and breadth of Russia, because Stalin was very anxious to keep Adolf happy. At the same time, the British and French Communist parties were agitating, creating strikes, causing sabotage, and urging the workers of the world to fight against the Western plutocrats like Churchill and join the common workers' struggle of Uncle Adolf and Uncle Joe, who were best buddies, as I repeat, at this time, and carving up Europe between them. Remember, there wouldn't have been a Second World War if Hitler hadn't been confident that he had a deal with Stalin. And Stalin was looking forward to the Western powers in Germany grinding each other into dust over 4 years of trench warfare, because nobody, even the German generals by and large, did not expect the victory, the Sichelschnitt of 1940. That came as a surprise to everybody. Stalin and other people calculated that there would be a long, hard struggle which would reduce both the Western powers and Germany to a state when he could move in and take over. But you won't be taught that in the history books. So we have every reason to stand up and say, as a nationalist movement, that we want the real version of the facts to be presented. Remember again that America only joined the war because of the Japanese struggle. There could have been two separate wars. It's only the accident that Hitler declared war on America on December the 11th, that the two wars came together. The Americans were by no means rushing to our aid, and there was a very strong isolationist lobby. If Yamamoto hadn't made the mistake of attacking the Americans at Pearl Harbor, which he didn't need to do to secure the assets he wanted in the Dutch East Indies, Malaya and Burma, the Americans might never have entered the war, even against Japan. And they certainly wouldn't have declared war on Germany if Hitler hadn't declared war on them. But you won't get that in the history books because, of course, we have the special relationship. Except it wasn't very special when the Americans were basically selling us everything in exchange for long-term credits, which they cashed in on. I think we paid off the last of the American deals only very recently. And a final point, if you read John Keegan's 6 Armies in Normandy, which I urge you to do, he points out that the British and the American troops in Normandy in 1944, by and large, didn't really know what they were fighting for. There are questionnaires. There are evidence on morale saying quite clearly nobody really knew after the original crisis of the so-called invasion of Britain, which could never have occurred because Germany didn't have the maritime assets to launch an invasion. I mean, the myth of the Battle of Britain served its purpose, but Churchill knew at the time, because he was sending all the military assets he possibly could to the Western Desert, so he clearly wasn't expecting an invasion either. It was a useful myth to focus the attention of the British people on their survival, that there was a threat to their survival, but there actually wasn't. So the Battle of Britain was largely a myth because the Germans would never have got past the Royal Navy. But the final point I want to make is, notice how these days you just don't read about the German army, it's the Nazi army. Now, not everybody in the German army was a Nazi, and most of them, if asked, would say, I'm fighting for Germany. But an awful lot of ex-communists, ex-social democrats, ex-conservatives, ex-everything else. There were huge plots in the German army against Hitler from start to finish. The idea that we were fighting Nazism is a modern myth which is being created for ideological purposes to get the idea of nationalism firmly put into the bad boys' corner. So that's the first myth. The second one is obviously the question of mass immigration from the Caribbean and the Indian subcontinent. As I say, I never heard this argument about they came here to rebuild Britain. I do recall a documentary in which a lot of people from the Windrush said that they'd come to Brixton because there was mass unemployment in the West Indies. There was a collapse of the local economy. I mean, you can only export so many bananas, so much rum, etc. And there was a local crisis. They came to Britain looking for work. They went from labour exchange to labour exchange in South London looking for work. Well, does that sound like a government scheme to introduce workers which we sorely needed? It doesn't to me. I don't know if it does to you, but I suspect this idea they're invited in to rebuild the country is a very modern myth. And it has to be challenged before it becomes established. The whole point is that you can look at what happened there in terms of push and in terms of pull. You can ask what pulled people in here, and you can ask what pushed them out of their homelands. Now, what pulled them in here? We're being told that it was to rebuild the country. Well, all I can say is that when I was around as a school kid, I didn't see many Pakistanis working on building sites. What they were employed in, by and large, was poorly paid night shift work in mills, or in public corporations. They worked for something like the Birmingham Corporation bus service, or, above all, the railways. In other words, they worked in sectors of the economy which were exceptionally, even by British standards in the 50s and 60s, poorly paid and bad conditions. And I think there's a much simpler explanation. They were hired as the cheapest possible labour to do the most unpopular jobs. But that's not the same as being invited in to rebuild the country. That's saying that they found a niche doing jobs which other people were not prepared to do. I do know from people in Bradford that I've spoken to, going back to that era, that there was never a problem getting people to do night shifts in mills, providing they were paid a reasonable rate. But the mill owners did not want to pay a decent rate. So they were quite happy to scour the four corners of the globe to get cheapest labour possible. But that's not the same as inviting people in to rebuild the country. That's saying we are utterly unscrupulous, ruthless, grad-grind employers, and we will find anybody who will live 15 to a house and do a night shift because we won't pay a decent rate. In other words, there was a possible alternative future for Britain in the 1950s, one in which working class people would have risen through simply the inexorable laws of supply and demand. Their labour would have been in demand, there might not have been enough supply, therefore wages would have risen, but that would have given them money to spend on goods and services and thereby raised the economy generally. It's a different track to the one which has been practiced, but just imagine what a different Britain we could be living in if ordinary working class people could have something like lower middle class jobs and the spending to go with it, and their kids could have the education that would follow from that and the rest of it. We could have had a very different last 50 years if instead of going down the route of mass immigration of cheap unskilled labour, which then hangs around even when the last mill has shut down and is going to be a permanent burden on the future, to what has happened. The other side of it is, of course, the push argument, and you'll never hear this in the textbooks. By push, I mean that what we've actually had is the people who wanted to leave their homelands the most, not the ones that we needed the most. We've had the worst of the world's people, not the best. If we'd sat down and planned our future, we'd have said, right, we want highly educated people, preferably white, preferably Christian, so that they can be assimilated relatively easily. But that's not what we've got. If you open your doors wide and say, we'll take anything, and there are people out there living in civil wars, living in conditions of absolute poverty, you get them because they need to get out of their situation the most, and they land on your doorstep. And then, as one of the previous speakers said, you have the problem that at the same time you start attributing housing to need rather than contribution. And I refer you to the well-known book on the East End by Dench and other left-wing, old Labour sociologists, emphasising the East End has been completely devastated by the implementation of that policy of need, not contribution. Because obviously a starving refugee who turns up from the third world with a shirt on his back and 15 kids, his need is greater than yours. Even if you've paid into the system and paid your taxes and done your duty by your fellow citizen for 25 years, you're at the back of the queue because your needs are not as strong as his are. Your contributions might be infinite and his negligible, but the system has been changed. It's another of these rules, like the one which Theresa May and Amber Rudd are now being criticised for. It's a bureaucratic stroke of the pen which has had untold implications for future generations. But nobody voted for it. Nobody was even asked if they wanted to contemplate it, but it is now the norm. So as long as starving refugees turn up from third world countries, bringing with them their ancestral and ethnic hatreds, then we have to house them, even if it means pushing our own people back. And just to remind people of what they're escaping, the Partition Massacre is supposed to, of August 47 onwards. I was born shortly thereafter in what I should have been born in East Pakistan, but all the hospitals had gone to pieces by then, so I was actually flown on board to Calcutta to be born. Minor story, but indicative of the conditions in which the West Pakistanis were treating East Pakistan. Basically, all the money went to build Islamabad, so there weren't any hospitals in East Pakistan to be born in, if you follow me. And of course, in the Bangladeshi, the Bengali Uprising, 1971, would anybody care to hesitate to guess how many people were killed? Well, 3 million. Most of them Bengali citizens massacred by the Pakistani army or its surrogates, by militia gangs operating on behalf of the Pakistanis. One was hanged recently in Dhaka after long years of seeking him down and prosecuting him. But remember that people are arriving from the third world, not just from the subcontinent, but other countries. There was a civil war. I asked Peter Rushton if he could remember the exact details, but other people can doubtless look it up on their computers. There was a civil war in Guyana and Trinidad between East Indians and West Indians, because basically, if you think about their sociology, they're completely different. Apart from their racial differences, their societies are incompatible. But there was a civil war in the 70s between West and East Indians. We're all familiar, no doubt, with the trouble in Fiji, which has gone on for centuries. Ever since the British brought Indian labourers in to work there, there's been trouble between the Fijians and the Neo-Melanesians, or the Neo-Fijians, or Indians, who were brought in to grow sugarcane, which the Fijians were not prepared to do. And there was a little-known civil war in Natal, South Africa, in the late 40s between Zulus and Indians, again. But you won't read about any of this. It's all sanitized in the textbooks because it doesn't suit the case that racial antipathies are exclusively between black and white and are the fault of the whites. The fact of the matter is that different ethnic groups have been fighting each other ever since humanity began, and now that we know more about the fact that at one stage there were 6 different sorts of humanoids wandering around the globe at about 300,000 BC, and there's only one now, it's pretty reasonable to suppose that human beings have been wiping each other out on an ethnic basis for quite a long time. So my conclusion would be, let's fight these myths before they become accepted as the received wisdom by generations of school children who couldn't possibly challenge them on factual grounds by saying, my daddy says it wasn't like that at all, because they just won't be listened to. If we don't do it, nobody else will. But if we're going to do it, we have to do it as an organised, broad church movement. We cannot do it as individual parties sticking it in their election leaflets and hoping to get electoral advantage. We must do it as a national movement. Thank you.